Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura,
And I'm Tom.
and this is episode number 35. So, today we're talking about the biggest commercial nuclear accident in history, 3 Mile Island. So, as always, before we get into it, Tom, how much do you know about 3 Mile Island?
So I know something really, really bad almost happened. It was still bad, but it wasn't as bad. Like it's not Chernobyl, but it could have been a lot worse.
Yes, and there's so much more to it than that. I really had no idea of the full story around this. And like many of our topics, it's going to be quite a ride. And I promise you, this isn't the story that you think that you're going to hear. So, are you ready to get into it?
Let's talk about nukes.
Our story begins in the post war 1950s with the rise of nuclear atomic energy around the world. During World War II, this energy was harnessed as a weapon of war, but by the 50s, it was a promising source of power that was a safer and cheaper alternative to coal. A pro nuclear energy campaign hit the airwaves to help change public perception, with big promises of its possibilities that would put money back in the consumers' pockets. They were literally promised a $0 electricity bill from the use of nuclear power. And we all know that didn't happen. Go
What
ahead.
I find so interesting is that, in one respect, it is extremely deadly and dangerous. I'm sure you'll get into like the whole thing about the waste. At the same time, objectively, it is cleaner than coal, and it is a lot more environmentally friendly than coal, which I guess is not saying much. So that there's a weird kind of juxtaposition with that.
By the 60s, nuclear power had rapidly grown in popularity, and people were demanding cheap electricity to power their homes. The industry got moving, and from 1963 to 1979, the number of nuclear power plants built globally doubled every year. This was particularly helpful during the gas shortage in the 1970s. Pressurized water reactors, or PWRs, were originally made for the US Navy for use in submarines and aircraft carriers. Now, they were popping up in the form of power plants in suburban areas around the country. The public was assured that these power plants were safe, operated by well trained workers using the most sophisticated technology for the time. They never had to worry about an accident occurring. There were backup systems for the backup systems if something were to go wrong. With its rapid exponential growth, nuclear power was now primed to replace coal and gas. One of the sites chosen for a nuclear power plant was a large sandbar in the middle of the Susquehanna River, about 12 miles from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The site would become known as 3 Mile Island. Ordered by General Public Utilities Corporation, construction began on 3 Mile Island in 1968, and the first reactor was completed and opened in 1974. So, 6 years. It took them 6 years to just do the first unit.
It's also maybe the third weirdest thing to be on an island in the Susquehanna near Harrisburg, along with an island with a baseball stadium and a random Statue of Liberty. Have you ever seen that? The Statue of Liberty replica in
No.
Harrisburg? That's
Mm-mm.
literally just sits in the middle of the river on an island.
Construction on a second reactor was set to be completed by 1975, but delays pushed back the completion until 1978. By the time the second reactor was completed, 70% of the United States was supported by nuclear power, and 3 Mile Island was to supply power to 300,000 homes. The Metropolitan Edison Company, or MET-Ed, took over the direct management of 3 Mile Island. Reactor Unit 1 ran smoothly and without notable issue since its opening. The same can't be said for Reactor Unit 2. Once up and running, it had a series of unscheduled shutdowns for various technical issues, and the operators had difficulty solving these issues. Not wanting to lose their jobs, the operators of Unit 2 allegedly started falsifying data about the reactor's performance to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, also known as the NRC.
This is how it starts.
Not starting off well, and it's not going to get any better. By February of 1979, Unit 1 was shut down for routine maintenance and refueling, leaving Unit 2 to carry its load as well. Now, Tom, I sent a picture to you of what this looks like, and I think it's kind of important just to understand the basics of this so you understand like what happened. So you essentially have three buildings. You have the reactor building, which is the one in the middle, where the nuclear reaction occurs, and it's housed in the steel reinforced concrete containment shell to avoid any radiation escaping. And then you have the turbine building, which produces the steam that produces the electricity, and it's also connected to the cooling towers. And finally, you have the auxiliary building, which houses radioactive waste systems and control systems. So, in the simplest possible way I can explain this, not being a nuclear physicist, is that essentially the nuclear reaction produces heat that heats water that turns into steam, which powers the turbine and generates electricity. Does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. Basically, the water creates steam, and the steam turns the wheel, and the energy that's created from the turning of the wheel, that's the actual electricity. The same way like a dam would work, like a hydroelectric dam would work, just
Okay.
with nuclear reaction instead of just rushing water.
I can't tell you how frustrating it was to like try to understand this because the documentaries that I watched got so technical about it that I literally Googled, explain to me in the simplest possible terms how this works. So that's where we ended up after a couple hours of these documentaries.
At that point, then you have to be like Denzel Washington in Philadelphia. Explain this to me like I'm a 5-year old.
Yeah.
Like I still don't understand how that process leads to like nuclear waste, radioactive waste from that process.
Well, from what I understand, there's some nuclear waste filtered out that goes in that auxiliary building. By the time like the steam gets out and the electricity is generated, like it doesn't have any radiation in it. So it's like filtered through systems and there's water that's filtered. So it kind of the waste is supposed to be contained in the auxiliary building by itself and not have contact with the outside.
I remember too that that was the whole problem with nuclear was that you had these barrels of waste that you had to store somewhere that we're literally running out of places to store.
Yeah. That does come up a little bit later. Yeah. Back to 3 Mile Island. In the early morning hours of March 28th, 1979, Unit 2 was working at 97% capacity of full power production when the feed water pump that sent water to the steam generator failed for reasons that are still unknown. Automated systems immediately shut down the steam turbine and the generator as they should have. Over 100 alarms sounded, some of which were unnecessary, and it led to a lot of confusion for the overwhelmed operators. Without the nonstop flow of water, the nuclear reactor would start to heat up and pressure would build. A pilot operated relief valve, or PORV, was opened in the primary system to release this pressure. This happened automatically. Here's where things start to go downhill. That relief valve should have closed again, but it didn't. It was stuck open, and there was no indication in the control room that this valve hadn't closed. This allowed a third of the cooling water to escape the system over the next 2 hours. Operators then noticed that the emergency feed water pumps turned on, but failed to notice two lights that were indicating that there was no water in those pumps. Thinking that the main water pumps were still pushing water and not wanting to flood the reactor, the operators turned off the emergency water pumps. With no water getting to the reactor, the core started to overheat. By 6:22 a.m., the relief valve that was stuck open was closed again. The loss of coolant stopped, but the incident continued. It took another hour or so for the operators to turn on the emergency water pumps again, and it's unknown why it took so long, but 20 minutes later, operators noticed that these pumps were violently vibrating, so they turned them off again. As time passed, the reactor's core temperature and radiation levels were steadily continuing to climb, and they still couldn't figure out exactly why. The control room was packed with operators, and nuclear experts were trying to call in on the one line that connected to the control room, but were met with busy signals. By 7:30 a.m., a general emergency was declared as the incident at 3 Mile Island continued to unfold, but the public wouldn't know about it for about another hour. Met-Ed notified Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, which in turn contacted other state and federal agencies. It wasn't until around 8:30 a.m. that a local radio station reported the issue at 3 Mile Island after a listener had picked it up on a police scanner. So this is not the optimal way to tell the public what is happening.
Every time there's a, emergency, you always kind of want to control the message. Having it leak out because someone heard it on a police scanner, or the famous a guy heard from a guy who heard from a guy who the guy who does his lawns works there, or something like that. Like, that's not ideal. Basically, what I'm already kind of seeing is it's been 2 hours. Not a single person there knows whether or not there's literally fucking water in the thing. And people are trying to call in, and there's one line.
Yeah. I mean, it was late 1970s, so I get it. But yeah, at this point, the two issues are the relief valve got stuck open, which let the coolant water go, too much of it. And then they weren't aware that there wasn't water being pumped by the main pumps. So they didn't think the emergency pump should be turned on. And then, like I said, they weren't working properly. So they turned them off again. And it was a scramble just to figure out why this was happening. They just didn't understand.
Meanwhile, this giant plant that is now essentially a bomb is getting pressurized and is overheating like the engine on an AMC Pacer.
Yes, but much more dangerous.
Listen, the AMC Pacer was dangerous on its own. Thank you very much.
This is where the media frenzy started, and Met-Ed would get caught in one of the worst PR disasters of all time. When reporters arrived at 3 Mile Island to cover the story, they were assured that a minor accident had occurred and that it had been handled. Contradictory information was also being sent to state and federal agencies, including the NRC and the White House, who were now involved. Met-Ed didn't want to admit that the situation was still spiraling out of control. Inside the plant, radiation had begun to spread and precautions were taken to protect the operators. But they still needed someone to get a more accurate measure of the radiation coming from the nuclear reactor. As they tried to come up with a game plan, one account said that it was allegedly suggested to send in people with terminal cancer to obtain the measurement, which is disgusting.
That's Gordon Gekko brain. That's just pure capitalism brain.
And in this documentary that mentioned it, it was like, it was said and then like quickly moved on. But still, like, who the fuck put that out there? Like, that's just gross.
You know what you could also do? Not fucking say it.
One worker eventually volunteered to risk his life to measure the radiation and was horrified by what he found. The amount of radiation in the coolant that was still left was off the chart. It was also found that the core temperature was climbing to 4,000 degrees, an oversight that happened because the temperature readings in the control room only went up to 700 degrees. At this point, a small amount of radiation was released into the atmosphere outside of the plant, but this would also be kept from the public for 2 more days. In the hours after the incident, then Governor of Pennsylvania, Dick Thornburgh, debated with officials on whether to issue a full evacuation of the surrounding area. The problem was that there was no viable evacuation plan for these towns. Eventually, it was announced that pregnant women and children 5 and under within a 5-mile radius should evacuate the area, and residents within a 10-mile radius should stay indoors as a precaution. They told the public that no radiation was detected off of 3 Mile Island, though at this point, the plant operators knew this to be false. As you can imagine, all hell broke loose. People pulled their kids out of school and fled the area as quickly as they could. Back at 3 Mile Island, they were still trying to figure out what was happening. The core continued to overheat to the point where fuel rods in the reactor were starting to melt into the floor. Initially, they were hoping that the core would cool down on its own, and they didn't think there was anything to do but wait. It would luckily never breach the bottom of the containment shell. It wasn't until about 12 hours after the incident began that operators figured out that they had to restart the water pumps to get the water flowing again to the reactor core. Once they did, the temperature slowly fell and the reactor began to cool, though it was partially destroyed. What they later learned is that they were less than an hour and 1,000 degrees away from a total meltdown. So this was, as you kind of mentioned in the beginning, very close to being complete disaster. A crisis was averted, or so they thought, but it wasn't over just yet. In the meantime, representatives from Met-Ed and state and federal agencies continued to give conflicting information to the media, to the point where interviews only minutes apart gave the opposite information. They sent out individuals who didn't understand the highly technical explanation of what was happening, which made them look less credible. This, of course, led to more panic and more confusion and the loss of public trust. The media turned up the pressure on Met-Ed to the point where a representative defensively responded to a question, quote, "I don't understand why we need to tell you every single thing that we do." I saw a clip of it, and it's not a good look.
That's not being candid. That's just being stupid. First of all, one, thank God we didn't have social media or cable news when this was happening, because that would have been, I mean, it was bad enough when it was happening at the time. But if we had social media or cable news, this would have been off the fucking charts.
I can't even imagine. I mean, TikTok alone would just completely blow up, no pun intended, with information about this and conspiracies about this.
That, Twitter, I mean, that's why you have people now, basically all they do is teach media literacy. Because when you don't have that, shit like that gets said. Back when we had journalistic standards, they got roasted, and absolutely rightly so.
Yeah, I don't think there was even time, and I don't even know if they did this back then, but like there was no time to get like PR crisis management together. You know what I mean? This is the same day.
I mean, the other thing too, which I guess probably saved them, is the amount of media you're dealing with is a lot less. Like, you're not dealing with national media, you're not dealing with like national outlets. You're dealing with whatever TV stations are in Harrisburg. You're dealing with probably the news radio, and I think probably the Patriot News, which is the newspaper. So you're not dealing with the amount of media attention that you would have been dealing with even 10 to 15 years later.
I mean, this did hit the national news. I just don't know if it was the first day or not.
That's the point I'm getting at, though. Like, even 10, 15 years later, CNN would have had crews there within an hour.
Yeah. The next day, as operators continued to monitor the core, they discovered a bubble of highly flammable hydrogen gas at the top of their reactor building. It was unclear if there was enough oxygen left in the reactor to cause a catastrophic explosion. By March 30th, officials told the public that trace amounts of radioactive material were released into the atmosphere and that there was a potentially dangerous hydrogen bubble still in the reactor building. Again, the media went nuts talking about what would happen if the bubble burst. The governor was working behind the scenes on a wider evacuation plan, but did not give any further evacuation orders. The surrounding areas were pretty much ghost towns at that point anyway, as 140,000 people had already fled. Back at 3 Mile Island, nuclear scientists were feverishly doing complex calculations trying to figure out if there was enough oxygen in the reactor to cause an explosion. Turns out there wasn't, and they slowly vented some of the hydrogen into the atmosphere. They did not immediately notify state and federal officials that they did this. The hydrogen bubble had actually been there for 2 days prior to the incident, which resulted in a small explosion in the reactor the day of. The explosion sounded like a ventilation door closing, so operators had no idea that this had happened. To help quell the public panic in the days after the incident, then President Jimmy Carter, who was a huge proponent of nuclear power, toured 3 Mile Island to show the public that it was safe. He ordered a 12-panel commission to investigate the incident that would later become known as the Kemeny Commission.
Not a single person here had any idea how to deal with a crisis. Like, not a one. Once this is happening, I understand when you're dealing with something like this, you're kind of not thinking about the future. You're thinking about, 10 minutes ahead of you. But you got to communicate this stuff. Like, you have to communicate this stuff to other agencies. You have to communicate this stuff to the media in a way that is calming and reassuring. Like, this is just basic PR or media relations. Anyone who works with media relations or is like a PR expert will tell you that, one of the things you're doing is you're trying to create trustworthiness. This is doing the exact opposite. And you're kind of letting the media run amok on this. The media is doing their job. They're asking questions. They're trying to bring truth to power, and they're also trying to do their job, which is to keep people informed. But when you're releasing hydrogen gas into the atmosphere and you're not telling anybody that you're doing it, that ain't good. That ain't it. And it just boggles my mind that you had supposedly the best and brightest people working there, and not a single one took any sort of leadership or responsibility to try and figure out what's going on here.
2 points on that, actually. So, the first one, I really believe that they thought these nuclear power plants were safe and that there was very, very minimal chance of anything happening. If you remember in the beginning how they were telling the public there's backup systems for backup systems. So I really think they thought it's almost like saying the Titanic was unsinkable. Do you know what I mean? Like, I really thought they believed that they were fine or they could handle this. Like, there was enough, I guess, fail safes to make sure that there wasn't, a nuclear meltdown. Because at this point, this was before Chernobyl, so there was no precedent on this. Do you know what I mean? And the second point I wanted to make was, in terms of the media, I get they were trying to do their jobs, and they were, but I think they, based on the lack of communication, it became this like worst case scenario thing, and they really blew it out of proportion. So I really think, and as we get to the end of the story, that the media really overhyped it. Like, they had their own role in this. Do you know what I mean? That wasn't optimal.
Anyone will tell you when you have media relations people, their entire job is to not let the media get themselves to a worst case scenario. Because basically when you're doing that, you're kind of, to use the office term, you're Dwight in your underwear talking on the talking on the phone, and you're not controlling the narrative. That's the whole point of having a media relations staff, is to not let the media run amok. Because when you're not providing information, and when you're inconsistent with your messaging, and when you're not really providing any sort of truthful information, it leads to just speculation and just kind of letting your imagination kind of run wild.
But I think that's exactly it. I think the media took speculation. And again, I'm not discounting the fact that they weren't given correct information or enough information. They absolutely weren't. So yes, one could assume that they're going to think worst case scenario here. So the media just speculating instead of going on what little facts they did have, like, I mean, really, is it the role of the media to speculate, especially back then, rather than to report facts? Like, where is that line? You have a journalism degree.
But that line's getting blurred by this point. Where
Yeah.
what? when this is happening, we're 6, 7 years past Watergate. So the line was already being blurred between what the media's role was pre-Watergate and what it was post-Watergate. Because Watergate really changed everything about how the media, especially the political media, portrayed itself. I mean, Woodward and Bernstein are now household names because they broke the Watergate story. So the media by this point is already kind of changing from just reporting the news to kind of inserting themselves into the news. It's not really the newspaper that's doing this. It's the electronic media. So it's radio, it's TV. Because by this point, they're probably doing wall-to-wall coverage. So you need something to fill that airtime. And it becomes very, very easy to just let these scenarios. If you've ever watched like TV news or cable news during a hurricane, you know how easy it is for the worst case scenario to be presented as not only fact, but it's already happening. You know, I always joke around, if you're in a city and Jim Cantore shows up in your city, that means some really not good shit's about to go down. When that happens, the electronic media was kind of left to their own devices. So what were they going to do? They're going to do the only thing they could, which is speculate, and in the absence of fact, let the worst case scenario play out.
So at this point, the cleanup of 3 Mile Island started immediately. So Tom, do you want to guess how long this took or how much it cost?
When we say cleanup, are we talking about the amount of time it took to just clean it up, or the amount of time that it took to clean it up and have it functional again?
Unit 2 was never functional again.
Okay. I am going to say 6 months and 6.8 million.
Very specific amount there. Well, I'm about to blow your mind here. The cleanup took 14 years and cost $1 billion and required 1,000 workers to complete. Isn't that insane? 14 years and $1 billion.
That's absurd.
Now, you have to be obviously very, very careful and methodical with cleaning up radiation disasters, but like 14 years? Like, that's a long time.
Well, I'd imagine that things had to be done in very specific steps. Because by this, too, the eyes of the world are on them. So they know they can't make a mistake. So if it takes 14 years, then it takes 14 years.
It wasn't until 1984 that the top of the nuclear reactor was removed and the full extent of the damage was seen. 60% of the reactor core was damaged. It was much worse, and they were much closer to a total meltdown than they originally thought. All parts of the nuclear plant had to be decontaminated, and anything that had been exposed to radiation, including the water used in the cleanup, had to be shipped to this containment center and either stored or evaporated. So, as you alluded to in the beginning, a lot of this radiation, there's not a lot of places it can go, so they just store it in these safe areas, but at some point it's going to be too much. We're not going to have room, for all this nuclear waste,
Well, now is the whole thing, because I want to say, I think John Oliver did a piece about it once where it was talking about the fact that we have all this nuclear waste from plants that we're running out of places to go to, and it has to be stored for hundreds of years, essentially.
Most people aren't interested in just one topic.
Don't settle for a podcast about just one subject. That rhymed.
Greetings. We're technically a conversation, a podcast for curious people by curious people.
On our podcast, we do things just a little bit different.
Every week, we share a new topic, and the other hosts have no idea what the topic will be.
Our topics are all over the place, from light and funny to dark and sometimes spooky.
We've covered everything from true crime, historical events and people, the supernatural and the occult,
I like that.
urban legends and folklore.
My favorite.
No matter what we cover, we try to make the episodes interesting and funny.
Don't mean to be the bad guy, but our lawyer said we legally couldn't call our show funny.
We have a lawyer.
Let me tell you what I told our lawyer. Come here so I can show you how far I can legally stick my high-heeled boot up your...
Check us out at technicallyaconversation.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Technically a conversation.
We're like a lifestyle brand.
Yeah.
They were able to contain most of the radiation, though a good amount had seeped through into the concrete floor, making decontamination more difficult. Cleanup of the radiation in the floor had to be left for when Unit 2 would be decommissioned. The cleanup was completed in 1993, and Unit 2 was shut down permanently. Unit 1, as I mentioned earlier, had shut down for routine maintenance and refueling at the time of the accident, and any connection that it had to Unit 2 was cut immediately. Unit 1 stayed closed until 1985 when it came back online, despite a ton of public opposition. You can see this video of these protesters with signs against reopening 3 Mile Island, and you can't really blame them after this.
Well, especially if it's the same people running it. Like we were talking about before, that's kind of the great irony in all of this is, yes, it is more environmentally friendly and renewable than coal or fossil fuel, and it's better for the environment. But the downside is that when it goes bad, it could be catastrophic.
Numerous epidemiological studies were conducted, testing milk, water, air, soil, vegetation, and residents in the surrounding areas. Most studies found no increased health risks or increase in cancer deaths and no negative effects on the environment. They did conclude that 2 million people were exposed to trace amounts of radiation, but that it was equivalent to the exposure somebody would get from a routine X-ray. Not everybody agrees with those conclusions, though. A few studies point to an increase in thyroid cancer diagnoses and infant mortality rates in the years following the incident. Many studies have been deemed not credible, and there was no causal link that could be made between the increased health effects and the accident at 3 Mile Island. The only public health effect that everyone agrees on was the stress and anxiety experienced by the local residents around this event, especially children. Some children had recurring nightmares about the nuclear plant exploding for quite a while afterwards.
No one should have to have dreams about that.
No. The media went on to report that if 3 Mile Island had had a total meltdown, 45,000 people would have died and 250,000 would have been injured, but officials think that this is over-exaggerated. Something else that fueled public panic around 3 Mile Island was the release of a movie 12 days prior to the accident called The China Syndrome. Starring Jane Fonda and Michael Douglas, it was about a reporter and cameraman who witnessed a potential nuclear meltdown at a power plant as numerous safety violations are uncovered. This movie was a big hit and it was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. Nuclear experts say that it was a character assassination of the entire industry and that the perceptions around the safety of nuclear power plants has never fully recovered. As you can imagine, 3 Mile Island was the fears stoked by this movie coming to life. Have you ever seen that movie or heard of that movie?
I've seen parts of it. There was another movie I was thinking of that I thought was that movie, but now that you say that's the movie I was thinking of when you were telling me this story, is China Syndrome.
After the 3 Mile Island incident, the anti-nuclear movement grew exponentially. Many people believed that the nuclear power industry would just completely implode, and by the early 80s, at least 50 planned nuclear power plants were canceled. It wasn't until 2010 that nuclear power started to regain popularity again, when President Obama made large investments in the industry because it produced zero carbon emissions. Nuclear power had a difficult time competing with natural gas, and today it only accounts for about 20% of the energy consumption in the United States. The accident at 3 Mile Island was rated a level 5 of 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale and is considered an accident with wider consequences. For comparison, both Chernobyl and the Fukushima nuclear disaster were classified as a level 7, a major accident. The Chernobyl disaster occurred in April 1986 when reactor number 4 exploded, causing a reactor core fire that burned for days while sending radioactive material into the air. The Chernobyl reactor reportedly had no containment structure because it was, quote, too expensive to add. It was concluded to be a result of operator error as well. The Fukushima nuclear disaster occurred due to the earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan in March 2011. There were multiple hydrogen explosions and 3 simultaneous reactor meltdowns, resulting in a substantial release of radiation. It was built on sea level behind a seawall, but it could not sustain the water that was produced from the tsunami. The number of casualties and health effects have never been released by the Japanese government, and because the plant used US-based technology, it wasn't a good look for the United States either.
Okay, so you kind of answered my question on how this was different than Chernobyl, and I actually forgot about Fukushima. But that one, there's really not a heck of a lot anyone could have done. I don't know what the odds were of that natural disaster hitting at that point at that time, but I don't think there's anything anyone could have done about that.
I do want to mention that a documentary, kind of unrelated, it was just about the Fukushima disaster, was that they thought that the seawall could sustain like up to a level 5 nuclear event. I guess in their minds, like the chances of anything greater than that happening was like super, super low. So this kind of was wrong place, wrong time. You know what I mean? But still, did they have to put it where it was? You know, did it have to be on sea level? I don't know.
I don't really think having just a singular retention wall is probably the best idea either, especially if you know the place is geologically active. The Chernobyl thing is that's hubris, and that was just kind of a product of the time. I don't think we'll ever really fully know the true effects of what happened there. For a lot of geopolitical reasons that, I won't get into here. But I don't think we'll ever really truly know the true impact of what happened with Chernobyl.
So there are a number of things that went wrong at 3 Mile Island, as concluded by the Kemeny Commission. They blamed the manufacturer, Babcock and Wilcox, Met Ed, and the NRC over the reactor system design, operator training, manuals and procedures, lack of safety communications, and to a lesser extent, operator error. The investigation was completed and the report was released within 6 months of the incident, before they knew the full scale of the damage to the core. I don't think the report was as robust and complete as it could have been, and the reason that they pushed it out so quickly was because Carter gave them 6 months to invest. I don't know if it was a financial thing, political thing, what it was, but they had 6 months to investigate and put out the report.
Well, and also, too, this was a big political issue for Carter, who I think was looking for anything to be positive in his favor.
And I never thought about that because I'm sure that they knew to some degree how long this would take to clean up, being a nuclear reactor disaster. Were they aware at that point that they probably wouldn't have all the information after 6 months? I don't know.
I mean, maybe, but again, at the same time, for the longest time, I think the book on Jimmy Carter was that his presidency was just kind of there. It was ineffectual, and it was just kind of, he was literally just the guy between Gerald Ford and Reagan. He was probably looking to show strength and solidarity against the company that was responsible for it. And I'm guessing there was probably a lot of political pressure too to get answers right away, regardless of whether or not it was actually possible.
That's a good point, yeah. Subsequent state and federal investigations also dug into these issues. One of the major findings was about the failure of the relief valve that got stuck in the open position. In the year and a half prior to the accident, manufacturer Babcock and Wilcox noted at least 11 failures with that valve. They supposedly found a fix to the issue, but the information was never communicated to Met Ed or the operators at 3 Mile Island. There was also a lack of proper maintenance of those valves within the system. So that's a huge manufacturer problem.
There were just so many people here who dropped the ball. How many times have we talked about corporations and things just trying to cut corners and trying to cut costs and it having devastating effects? You're paying billions of dollars for something that may have only had to pay 100 for back then to avoid it. This is that on a completely macro scale. I will say that, as you mentioned before, because there was really no precedent for anything like this happening, you had a staff, once it got past like the beginning stages of this, was completely over their head and had no idea what even to do. And, we're basically trying to dig up out of the hole instead of trying to just address what was in front of them. But when I hear things about just missing basic maintenance or basic infrastructure, which is just so uniquely American, that infuriates me because that's basic shit.
That's the kicker to me, that if they would have communicated this to 3 Mile Island, we wouldn't even be talking about this. Do you know what I mean? It seems like such a small thing that could have prevented all of this.
And it's those small things that often do it. The Challenger disaster was a little plastic ring that fell off during the launch. It's those little things that add up.
Other system issues included key indicator lights that were positioned on the backs of panels and tags covering other warning panels. The numerous alarms that went off were not adequately differentiated between a minor issue and a catastrophic one. The panel instruments didn't properly indicate what was happening inside the core, including how much water was inside, which was a major problem with this incident. Without knowing the correct water levels, operators took the exact opposite approach in addressing the overheating core. To make things worse, there was no effective way to cool down the core, especially if there was no water flow. This is why the operators at 3 Mile Island thought that they could just wait it out. The training manuals and operating procedures at 3 Mile Island left operators and management ill-prepared for the deteriorating situation caused by the loss of coolant water to the core. The manuals inadequately described how to handle the situation, and some of the information was flat out incorrect.
I talked before about how basically it was overheating like an engine. The way a radiator works inside a car is that basically there's water inside, and that's how the heat is dispelled inside the car. When there's a leak in the radiator, that's when the engine starts overheating. That's kind of what happened here because there was no friggin' water in the cooling system.
Exactly, that's a good analogy. All of these other issues overshadowed the operator error that day. One operator later admitted that he only checked one of 2 gauges before turning off the water pumps. Another operator failed to notice an alarm on the control panel, allegedly, and I want to stress allegedly here, because his stomach was blocking his view, Homer Simpson style. I do want to qualify that, saying that only one source mentioned that, so I don't know how true it is, but the image of like a Homer Simpson type character in this situation is just beyond for me.
Like, that's something that just can't be true.
Perhaps the only good thing to come out of 3 Mile Island was a more unified approach from the industry. New, more stringent regulations were put in place to improve plant design, equipment requirements, operator training, and emergency response. In the years after the accident, 3 Mile Island kept changing hands as companies bought and sold the nuclear power plant multiple times. By 2010, the electrical generator in Unit 2 was refurbished and installed at a nuclear plant in North Carolina. The remainder of Unit 2 was used for long-term storage and awaited the rest of its decommissioning with Unit 1. Unit 1 operated without incident from 1985 to 2019 and was considered one of the best performing nuclear reactors in the United States. It was shut down completely because its then owner, Exelon, didn't think that it was profitable enough to keep open. Exelon even lobbied the state to make policy changes that would make the operations more affordable or to subsidize overall operational costs. The state declined. Unit 1 was shut down 15 years sooner than expected, as it had a license to operate until 2034. The decommission process will take up to 60 years and cost $1 billion to complete. Today, there are ongoing arguments about 3 Mile Island, specifically around the issue of reopening Unit 1. Some residents are pushing for the reopening in order to access cheaper, cleaner energy as an alternative to coal and fossil fuels. Others express concern because of the partial meltdown of Unit 2 and any potential harm it may cause if Unit 1 was reopened. Something I don't understand here is Unit 1 was open until 2019. So you would think they would have caught any issues because of Unit 2 and any radiation that was escaping because of this. Like, that argument doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't, but I think, like with everything in our world now, it became a political issue. I think there were probably interests or individuals or someone that would probably be in their political interest to benefit off of kind of stoking those fears.
The current owner of 3 Mile Island, Constellation Energy, is conducting tests to determine if Unit 1 can be reopened. As of July 2024, no decision has been made about reopening Unit 1, as there are, quote, many economic, commercial, operational, and regulatory considerations remaining. So before we move on to the next part, I just want to give my brother a shout out for kind of filling me in that story. He lives up in that area and is aware of kind of the arguments going on around that. So shout out to him on that one. So Tom, what side of the argument would you be on? Reopening, not reopening?
Anything has to be better than coal. Like literally anything. Solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, anything has to be better for the environment than coal. That being said, the flip side is that when it goes bad, it goes really bad. And I don't necessarily know if I trust an energy company at this point to run a nuclear power plant, especially one that has the history that 3 Mile Island does. If there's a way to do it ethically, I would be in favor of it. But I don't know if the people that would have their hand on the till and have their hand on the buttons, so to speak, can really be trusted with it, if that makes any sense.
It does. And I think where I am is I do see both sides of the argument. After what happened here with the misinformation and the flat out lying to residents of this area, yeah, I would be a little concerned about reopening, but I honestly think that Unit 1 is fine. It's not a threat. Like I said, it's been in operation until 2019, so I think that it's safe. But I kind of lean more towards yeah, why can't we do wind farms? Why can't we do solar? Like, why do we have to? Why is that the only option? 3 Mile Island was a nuclear accident that was traumatizing for the residents, yet preventable by the manufacturer. It's also not quite the story that everyone may think, as it's less about the severity of the accident and more about the attempted cover-up by the manufacturer and Met-Ed. Kind of wrapping up here, Tom, I'm kind of walking away from this that the manufacturer and Met-Ed under-exaggerated it, and then the media over-exaggerated it. And the victims are obviously the residents who didn't know what the hell to think in this situation. Are you walking away with the same thing, or do you think something different?
It's a story of something that almost happened more than anything else. It's the overestimation and overexaggeration of what didn't happen, and it was the underestimation of what almost happened. I think that's really the best way to look at it. And unfortunately, there were a lot of innocent people who were kind of stuck in the middle of it.
What do you think about the conflicting studies about the health effects, where most of them, and I'm saying that with air quotes, are saying that there's no adverse health effects, where these littler ones are saying, yeah, there's been an increase in deaths and cancers. Like, I don't know. The conspiracy part of my brain is like, I feel like we're not getting the whole truth there. Of course, they say there's no causal link and correlation doesn't equal causation, but I don't know.
With any kind of study, you always have to look at who's funding it, right? Who's funding it, who's running it, what would it benefit? A scientific study, when it's done correctly, is supposed to look at the evidence and reach a conclusion. It's not supposed to have the conclusion already and then manipulate the experiment to reach that conclusion. Too often now we see scientific studies because it's nice fodder for TV news. Scientists say coffee can either make you impotent or can extend your life by 50 years. One or the other. When you're not aware of and I'm trying to be careful with my wording here because I don't want to make it seem like, I'm leaning one way or the other. I think you always have to be careful of where the research is coming from, and who's behind the research. If it's from a reputable place, and if the scientific method they use is sound, it bears a lot of weight. Without looking at the studies themselves, it's hard to say. I know it's a very hot take, but.
And I think, too, kind of figuring out what the motives are, if they have any of these researchers. But
how many times have you seen the study about the health effects of a certain, drug or drink or something, and it's being funded by the sugar industry? And not that I'm going out there and caping for misinformation, but I think you always have to be a little bit wary when the studies don't come from a reputable place.
they still really don't know for sure if there were adverse health effects. And I think that just does such a disservice to the residents of that area. Something else I wanted to ask you, and we'll kind of end on this. I feel like I should ask you this in the beginning, but I'm wondering if you grew up near any power plants, because where I grew up, there was one, it was about like 7 to 10 miles away. And I remember it was like every first Monday of the month at like 2 p.m., there would be, a test siren. And it's like, okay, you always knew that was the power plant. And if something were to happen, that's the siren. But like, as I was going through some of this, like, I guess the catastrophic effects that could have happened if something went wrong never crossed my mind growing up. And thank God. But it's like, I had no idea how dangerous this could have been. And that one was like right up the road from me. So did you grow up near one or around one?
The closest one I would have grown up near is Indian Point, which has its own very checkered history. It was in Westchester County in New York, and it was very controversial. There were always a lot of protests and stories about things that were being done or not being done, and it became a point of political contention so much so that I think Governor Cuomo, the most recent Cuomo, shut it down. But that was the closest one.
And I don't know if this is a fair argument, kind of going back to 3 Mile Island, that when it happened, it almost had the impact of a Chernobyl until Chernobyl happened 7 years later. And I think when that happened, I didn't find this in my research at all, but like after Chernobyl, I wonder if fears softened a little bit. Like, okay, it wasn't that, I have no idea.
3 Mile Island is still talked about in that way, which is wild because it is something that, again, almost happened. Not to say that it wasn't nothing, but it's wild to have something that was definitely not as bad as it could have been talked about in the same way as something that was even worse.
So tell us what you guys think. Was your perception of 3 Mile Island the story that we told? Was it worse? Was it better? Like, what do you guys think of 3 Mile Island? Definitely let us know.
And as always, we thank you for listening. We thank you for following us on TikTok and on social media and on YouTube. You can find us on TikTok at the Tell Me About Podcast. You can find us on YouTube at the Tell Me About Podcast. Follow us and subscribe to us there. We're going to have a lot of content for you. And we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode. So look out for that.
All right. We'll see you in 2 weeks, everybody.
Bye.